This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist.
Chapter 20. Political Decentralization in Greece. We referred in the first part of this work to the irreconcilable opposition between the political endeavors of small minorities in history and the culturally creative activity of socially allied human groups, and tried to make the results of this inner antagonism as clear as possible to the reader. Everything else follows from this. Before all, it follows that in periods when political thought and action prevail in society, cultural creation, and especially its higher forms, fall into decay and collapse. If it were otherwise, then culture would have been in the fullest bloom in times of highest perfection of national political power, and would have withered in times of national dissolution. But history everywhere shows us the opposite. Greece and Rome are the classical witnesses of this, but not the only ones. The history of all times and all peoples bears eloquent testimony to it. Nietzsche had recognized this very clearly when, in his well-known utterance on the resurrection of the spirit, he said, "On the political sickbed, a people usually renews its youth, and finds again the soul it lost in seeking and maintaining power. Culture is most deeply indebted to times of political weakness." About the outstanding importance of the ancient Grecian culture peoples are fairly well agreed. Even if one is of the opinion that this culture has been too highly idealized by the enthusiastic partisans of classical antiquity, one still cannot deny its monumental importance. The immoderate overestimation which was at one time accorded to classical antiquity is easily explained. One must not forget that with the development of the Christian Church, Europe for centuries almost entirely lost its connection with Greek intellectual life, which, of course, seemed to Christian thought essentially alien and revolting. By the rediscovery of the Greek language and the universal awakening of minds toward the close of the Middle Ages, man became again spiritually united with ancient Hellas. On the humanists of the 16th century, this ancient world, which so suddenly emerged from oblivion, and which, seen from a distance, glittered with 1,000 hues, must have made an actually bewitching impression, especially since it suggested immediate comparison with the present, when the Church was more and more vigorously combating the new conceptions of the universe with torture and the stake. Without doubt, Greek culture had, along with its illuminating and alluring features, also profound social defects, which one must not overlook if one wishes to form a clear picture of its total character. Thus, one must not forget that in Greece, as in every other state of antiquity, slavery existed, even though, except in Sparta, the treatment of slaves was much more humane than, for example, in Rome. In many Greek communities, it was even customary to set free those slaves who acquired a Greek education. It also happened, sometimes under unusual circumstances, that part of the slaves were adopted into the master class. This happened in Sparta at the time of the Archidamian War, when the privileged caste had been greatly weakened by its losses, and had to deal with an uprising of the Helots. The same thing occurred repeatedly in Athens. Also, the history of Greece is by no means entirely free from persecutions of ideas. Socrates had to drink the hemlock, Protagoras had to flee, and his book about the gods was publicly burned. Diogenes of Apollonia and Theodorus the atheist were subject to persecutions. Even poets like Diagoras of Milos and Aeschylus were sometimes in peril of their lives, and Euripides was threatened with a public indictment because of his godless ideas. Of course, these occasional persecutions cannot be compared even remotely with the persecutions of heretics during the Middle Ages. The basic assumptions for the latter were entirely lacking in Greece. There was neither an organized priestly caste nor a church. The country lacked also any start toward political unity, the supporters of which are always inclined to suppress free thought and to raise persecution of certain ideas to a system. However, there existed, of course, among the people themselves, all sorts of superstitions, and in many places, especially in Delphi, this had developed under the influence of the priests into a fanatical orthodoxy. But this had only local importance, since all organized connection with other parts of the country was lacking. Despite such defects, the intellectual greatness of Grecian culture is undisputed. A culture which could influence the totality of European peoples for so long, and in such diverse fields, with an irresistible power which has not yet exhausted itself today, though its creators vanished from history 2,000 years ago, may easily be overvalued. It can hardly be overlooked. No man of profound insight will try to maintain that the Greeks originated among themselves all the contributions they have made in the various fields of cultural life. The greatness and significance of every culture lies just here. Its intellectual and social effectiveness cannot be confined within political or national boundaries. Perhaps a state can be created with a sword, but not a culture. For this stands above all state organizations or lordly institutions, and is in its innermost essence anarchistic. Even if one could overlook the fact that thus far political bondage has been the greatest hindrance to any higher cultural development. That Greece was influenced in its development by other cultures is perfectly obvious, and one would have to be a race theorist to deny it. Besides, the Greek mythology itself bears witness to those foreign influences, as in the legends of Cadmus, Cecrops, Danaos, and others. In recent times, there has been hardly a year in which scientific research has not brought to light new material that reveals more clearly the Oriental and Egyptian influence upon the shaping of Greek culture. Thus, these Semitic elements in the poetry of Homer have been repeatedly brought out. Of quite especial importance were the excavations of Heinrich Schliemann in Asia Minor, which laid bare the remains of an ancient culture now called the Mycenaean. Then, in 1900, came the excavations of the English scholar Evans on the island of Crete, bringing to light the vestiges of a very much older culture which can be assigned to a time at least 2,000 years before our chronological era. These splendid results of archaeological research have, of course, opened up the historiography new and hitherto quite unknown fields, but they have also produced a whole series of new problems, at the solution of which science has thus far worked in vain. Thus it is today undecided whether there were intimate connections between the Cretan and the Mycenaean cultures, or whether we are here dealing with two distinct developments. The question whether the creators of these two cultures should or should not be regarded as Greeks remains quite unsolved. There have been discovered in Crete, it is true, thousands of clay tablets bearing strange inscriptions, but science has not succeeded in deciphering them, and we wait still the many facts they might tell us. It was proved long ago that other languages were once spoken in Greece. A whole series of place names like Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Olympus, and Parnassus are still veiled in darkness. They have no sort of relation to the Greek language, belong, indeed, to no Indo-Germanic speech. Besides, Herodotus tells us that in his travels he visited various cities in which the Pelasgians spoke a peculiar language which he designated as barbaric. According to the sagacious inferences of Moritz Heurns, the Cretan-Mycenaean culture is, so to speak, the connecting link between the ancient cultures of Egypt and the Orient, and that of Greece. A view that is constantly winning wider acceptance. The fact is that the active intellectual life of Greece first developed in the East, where intercourse with Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Persians was most active. But we are not here dealing with the question of how far Grecian culture was influenced by other cultures, but merely with the fact that it is one of the most splendid and all-embracing cultures that humanity has ever produced. It affected the whole subsequent development of the peoples of Europe more deeply and more permanently than did any other culture, and its remote effects are still becoming clearer and clearer. Before all, there is the kind of thought process which the Greeks brought closer to us than any other people of antiquity. Their peculiar gift for scientific observation and deductive reasoning, often enabling them to recognize facts which were not scientifically established until many centuries later, had much more kinship to our present ways of thinking than had the mysteries of the Egyptians or the Babylonians. Though it is today beyond question that the Greeks first got their knowledge of astronomy and other matters from the Oriental peoples, still they organized this knowledge with a luminous clarity and developed it to a height which no other people in ancient history was able to attain. Their highly developed mathematics is glorious evidence of this. The very fact that among Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Persians, all knowledge about nature was kept in the possession of the priests and magi, while in Greece science and factual theoretical thinking were carried on by men who had no connection of any kind with a priestly caste, is characteristic of the general status of intellectual life. Although only fragments of the ideas of the Grecian thinkers have come down to us, and much of this only at second hand, principally from Aristotle and Cicero, and the transmission was not without some distortion of the original text, still the little that we now possess gives a clear enough understanding of their intellectual productiveness. Even in the old Ionic nature philosophies, one encounters that luminous keenness of observation combined with clarity of expression which is so characteristic of the thinking of the Greeks. Thales, Anaximander, Pherecydes, Anaximenes, and others based everything on the study of nature, which gave to their teachings from the very beginning a distinctive stamp. On the basis of the statements of Anaximenes, who was already acquainted with the movements of the constellations and of the pole star, and the ideas of the Pythagoreans, Aristarchus of Samos arrived at last at the conclusion that the earth turns on the axis once every 24 hours, and that the earth and all the planets revolve about the sun once every year, while the sun and the fixed stars remain motionless in space. Of course, the Greeks lacked any scientific hypotheses, such as we have command of today, as a basis for their teachings, but the way in which they constructed for themselves a picture of the universe which quite overshadows everything that for 1500 years the men of a later period believed in as unassailable truth is very significant. The ancient sages brought the same interest to the consideration of the changes in matter. The well-known division of matter into 4 basic elements, earth, water, air, and fire, which is ascribed to Empedocles, controlled the ideas of men for many centuries and was at last only overthrown by the results of modern chemistry. The atomists took a decisive step toward the construction of a picture of the universe on natural foundations when they tried to establish the nature of matter. Of course, one cannot put the theories of a Democritus or a Leucippus without change on a level with the modern atomic theory of a Dalton or an Avogadro. The ancient lacked almost all the preparatory ideas for such. The thing about their theories, however, that arouses our astonishment even today is the magnitude of the undertaking, the all-embracing character of the concept, at a time when the most basic preliminaries of our present-day attainments in physics and chemistry were completely unknown. Since the atomists attributed every phenomenon to natural causes, they banished from their conception of the universe accident and whim, and consequently that manner of thought which tries to find a special purpose in all things. One can, therefore, understand why Bacon so greatly admired Democritus and preferred his doctrines to those of Aristotle and his blind Christian followers. There have come down to us scarcely 400 lines in all of Empedocles' great didactic poem about nature. He has been called the earliest forerunner of the Lamarckian Darwinian theorists, and, with the necessary limitations, the characterization may be allowed to stand. Empedocles recognized in love and aversion the 2 primitive forces which manifest themselves as attraction and repulsion, and to whose operation the origin and dissolution of all things may be traced. Men, animals, and plants are composed of the same materials, but the mixture is different for each species. In the course of incalculable ages, by numberless combinations and separations, plants gradually came into existence, then animals. At first, nature produced all organs separately, arms without shoulders, heads without necks, and so on, and finally only those forms persisted which were capable of existing independently. It is even asserted of Xenophanes, the alleged founder of the Eleatic school of philosophy, that he tried to explain the fossil imprints of plants and animals in stone as relics of once living species that had become extinct. Xenophanes recognized also the anthropomorphism that underlies every belief in divinities, and asserted many centuries before Feuerbach that in God man reveres his own nature. But not only the conception of things and the universe, the ways of thinking also early attracted the attention of the ancient thinkers and led them to the conviction that only through observation and experience could they arrive at definite laws and generalizations. This method seemed to them the first requisite for any knowledge whatever. By such a way of thinking, the practical sciences too would necessarily be brought to fullest fruition. In fact, the geometry of Euclid reached a perfection such that it could survive for over 2,000 years without revision of its content or change in its form. Not until the most recent time have new paths been opened up in this field. The same is true of the scientific experiments of Archimedes, who, with his theory of the lever and so on, first laid the foundation for a science of mechanics. The same freedom of thought is noticeable in all other fields as well. We encounter it in the philosophic schools of the Sophists, the Cynics, the Megarics, and later the Stoics, who concern themselves chiefly with the relations of men to society and its various institutions. From the rapid development of intellectual and social life in the Greek cities, there gradually arose entirely new ideas about the causes of ethical feeling and the relations of men to one another. The ancient belief in the gods, which finds in the Homeric poems an expression as childlike as it is natural, was dwindling away. Philosophy had opened new perspectives to the thoughts of men and had shown them how to become the masters of their own destinies. Thus arose a transvaluation of all traditional moral concepts, which was carried, especially by the Cynics and the Sophists, to the utmost limit, till Socrates demonstrated the true basis of all ethical feeling and social communal life. "Virtue," said he, "is not a gift from the gods, but the proved knowledge of what is really good and enables men to live without constraining others, to act justly and to serve, not merely themselves but the community. Without this, a society is unthinkable." Later, the Epicureans and the Stoics built further on this basis and developed their theories concerning the ethical consciousness of man. Besides, a large number of Greek thinkers busied themselves with the question of public economy and of the political structure of social life, and individuals among them arrived at most far-reaching conclusions. In this the ancient traditions of a golden age, which poetry had kept alive among the people, played a not inconsiderable part and gradually shaped themselves into the doctrine of natural right, which was so zealously advocated, especially by the Cynics. As a result of these ideas there developed gradually a totally new attitude toward social institutions and toward foreign peoples, which found its ripest expression in the teachings of Zeno, the pupil of the Cynic, Crates, and the Megarian, Stilpos, and culminated in the complete rejection of any exercise of force in society. There is hardly any other period in history which displayed such a lofty and many-sided intellectual life, but our admiration becomes still greater when we contemplate the array of Hellenic letters. The very oldest of the poetic works of the Greeks that have come down to us, the Iliad and the Odyssey, exhibit a poetic perfection of such strength and beauty that they are properly regarded as the very epitome of epic poetry. Close interweaving of a naively sensuous conception of the universe with the deepest impulses of the human heart, overpoweringly colorful splendor of landscape, intimate intergrowth of the human soul with external nature, and, above all, joyous spontaneity in depiction, reach here a height of perfection such as was seldom attained in later times, and only by the very great. The epic was succeeded by the didactic poem, as the inventor of which, old Hesiod of Askra, was honored. In place of the wonderful and the adventurous of the epic poetry there appeared dependence on the native soil, feeling for the useful busyness of everyday life, deliberate contemplation of things. The deeply implanted feeling of the Greeks for that most romantic of all arts, music, which finds such charming expression in the ancient myths of Amphion and Orpheus, led to the early development of lyric poetry to an unexampled height. If epic composition limited itself to the graphic depiction of the past, lyric poetry created its matter out of the inner experiences of the poet and wedded the rhythm of the verse to the notes of the lyre and the flute, and so gave utterance to every stirring of the soul. Thus the poet became an indispensable guest at every public celebration, and cities competed with one another in devices to attract him within their walls. A long line of the most celebrated exponents of lyric poetic art came from the island of Lesbos, which came to be known as the native land of the lyric, in the narrower sense. There wrote Terpandros, the actual creator of Melian poetry, who fused together music and verse with such consummate art that the legend ran that he had found again the lost lyre of Orpheus. The lyric reached its zenith on Lesbos in the noble pair of poets, Alcaeus, the violent hater of tyrants, and the great poetess Sappho, whose intoxicating love poems are among the loveliest that were ever written. Arion, too, the singer of the Dionysian festivals and inventor of the dithyramb, hailed from Lesbos. In Anacreon of Teos, the enthusiastic singer of love and wine, the lyric of the ancients found its most graceful and joyous representative. With him wrote Ibycus of Rhegium, Simonides of Chios, and above all Pindar of Thebes, whom Quintilian honored as the prince of lyricists. Pindar was also famous throughout Greece as a writer of scholia. These scholia, or table songs, intended to lend added zest to the pleasures of the table, spread throughout all Hellas. And we should here think, too, of the former slave Aesop, the waggish composer of animal fables, whose humorous tales went from mouth to mouth. Every city had its singers and poets, and there is scarcely another period in history in which, in so small a country and in such a comparatively short time, such an astonishing number of poets and thinkers made their appearance as in the little communities of Greece. The Hellenes reached the summit of their poetic art in the drama, which developed from the ancient festival plays in honor of Dionysus or Bacchus. Dramatic poetry had a long line of more or less notable forerunners, of whom Epigenes of Sicyon, Thespis of Icarion, and especially Phrynichus, author of the tragedy The Capture of Miletus, are oftenest mentioned. But the drama reached its highest perfection after the Persian Wars, in the time of Athenian bloom, when Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, a constellation of three, illumined all Hellas with their glory, surrounded by poets like Philocles, Euphorion, Xenocles, Nicomachus, and many others. Of the 200 pieces by Aeschylus, only 7 have come down to us, among them his great tragedy Prometheus Bound, in which the daring temper, the gigantic power, and the magnificence of his ideas are revealed at their strongest. It is said of Sophocles that he wrote far more than 100 dramas, of which, however, only 7 have been preserved. From these we get an idea of the greatness of his genius, which finds its most perfect expression in his Antigone. Of the work of Euripides, the poet of enlightenment, as he has been called, more has been saved. Of the 200 dramas that have been ascribed to him, 19 have been preserved to posterity. His art was soberer than that of Aeschylus and Sophocles, and it was said, even in his lifetime, that while Sophocles represented men as they should be, Euripides showed them as they are. That he had the power to move men mightily by his representation is shown by his demonic depiction of passion, in which he was excelled by none. Greek comedy developed from beginnings similar to those of tragedy. It, too, grew out of the ancient festival plays, and was especially associated with the phallic choruses. But it was in Athens that comedy first reached its highest development. There Cratinus wrote, of whom it is told that even Pericles, the greatest statesman of Greece, did not escape his biting satire. And with him were Crates, Eupolis, Pherocrates, and others, who were, however, completely overshadowed by Aristophanes, that spoiled darling of the Graces. Of the 54 comedies of Aristophanes, only 11 have been preserved, but these suffice to give us a picture of the renowned poet, who knew how to combine the most withering scorn with the most gracious suavity. His biting wit knew no bounds. He lashed men and institutions with the boldest unrestraint, and without a trace of prudery. Although he was very conservative in his opinions, his devastating mockeries halted neither before gods nor official persons, and he lustily shook his cap and bells at the most sacred things. It was no accident that comedy and the drama reached their highest perfection just when the Athenian democracy was in fullest bloom. The utterly unrestricted presentation of comedy at that time shows a much better understanding of personal freedom than do the most beautiful descriptions in republican constitutions. For the spirit of a time is not defined by the dead letter of its laws, but by the living actions of its men, which first give it its imprint. If, finally, we cast a brief glance at what the Greeks brought forth in architecture, sculpture, and painting, we shall be able to estimate the whole greatness and depth of their culture. History knows many peoples which have done very great things in special fields of cultural creation, but the Greeks are perhaps the only people who were able to achieve the highest in every field of culture. It was this which gave to their creation that inner balance which for the last 2,000 years has constantly aroused the astounded admiration of the greatest minds. One understands what Goethe meant when he said of Greek art, "For all other cultures one must make allowances. To the Greek alone one is always a debtor." For the Greeks, art was not a private interest of individuals, which they pursued as if it were some sort of sport, but a creative activity that was intimately intergrown with their whole social life, and without which they could not conceive existence. The Hellenes were perhaps the only people that ever understood how to make an art of living itself. At least, no other people is known to us, among whom the intimate connection of art with every phase of personal and social life is so clearly and impressively apparent. A community like Athens, which spent more for the support of its theater and its dramatic art than than it did on the wars with the Persians, which threatened the entire political existence of ancient Hellas, is hardly conceivable to us today, in this time of state barbarity, when bureaucracy and militarism absorb enormously the greatest part of the national incomes of all so-called civilized peoples. But it was only in such a community that art could develop to such a height. This is especially true of architecture, the most social of all arts, development of which is completely dependent on the understanding that men bring to it socially. Only in a country where the individual constantly took the liveliest kind of part in public affairs and could easily keep track of those affairs, could architectonic skill reach such perfection. Among the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Persians, and other peoples of antiquity, architecture as an art was limited to the palaces and tombs of the kings and the temples of the gods. Among the Greeks we first find it applied to all the purposes of public life and to personal use. Besides, the Grecian temple breathed a very different spirit from the sacred buildings of Oriental peoples, whose shapeless massiveness expressed the whole oppressive and crushing weight of gloomy religious systems and rigid priestly dogmas. There hovers over the religious ideas of the Greeks the poetic glamour of a cheerful view of life, which regarded the gods as also human and was burdened with no life-hating dogmas. A healthy sensuality governed the life of the Greeks and set its mark even on their conceptions of divinity. The Hellene prostrated himself in the dust before no god. The idea of sin was utterly foreign to him. He never blasphemed against his humanity. Thus culture became for him a worldly celebration of the joy of life. Songs, dances, farces, tragedies, athletic contests, associated with joyous feasts where wine and love played no small part, followed one another in colorful sequence, and gave to the religious festivals their characteristic note. And this did not occur behind thick temple walls, but under the blue sky, in the midst of lovely natural settings, which supplied a fitting frame for these joyous exercises. The sense of the joy of life inevitably revealed itself in the works of man. Taine has sketched the peculiarity of architectonic achievement in Hellas in these words. There is nothing ceremonial, peculiar, torturedly artistic about this building. It is a rectangle surrounded by a row of pillars. 3 or 4 geometrical forms at the foundation support the whole, and the symmetry of the plan becomes apparent through the repetition of these and the opposition of them to one another. The crowning of the gable, the deck plate of the capital, all accessories and all detail equally make clear the peculiar character of every member, and the diversity of the coloring completes the emphasis and the elucidation of these values. This special type of architectonic artistry, this graceful, flexible beauty in which every line blends into a brilliant, harmonious whole, is found everywhere in Hellas. In the temple of Zeus at Olympia, in Apollo's temple at Phegalia, in the Theseum, in the Parthenon, from the propylaea of the Acropolis to the splendid works of Ictinus, Callicrates, and so many other masters. No art was so widespread among the Hellenes as sculpture. It surpasses, in fact, everything that peoples have ever done in this field, and constantly astounds us by the fabulous abundance of its creations. In the time of the Roman invasion, Roman generals plundered the art treasures of Greece to an extent unheard of. The reports even state that in Rome and its immediate vicinity, over 60,000 Greek statues were set up. Yet in spite of this, Pausanias, who lived in the 2nd century after Christ, in the time of the Roman emperors, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, could say after his great journey through Hellas that the whole country, from coast to coast, was like a great museum of art. According to Winckelmann, Pausanias tells of 20,000 statues which he had seen himself. From these figures, one can form an approximate estimate of the lavish abundance of Greek sculpture and of its wide distribution. The care of the naked body became for the Greeks a regular cult. Public games and athletic contests were a part of every festival, and offered to the eye of the artist the human body in every conceivable posture, giving ever new inspiration for the exercise of his creative power. Along with the individual masters there developed in such centers as Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Sicyon whole schools of sculpture. And what a horde of great artists do we find here! Agelades, who worked in Argos, was celebrated as the teacher of the 3 great masters, Phidias, Myron, and Polycletus. Phidias is known as the creator of the 40-foot-high statue of Zeus in his temple in Olympia. Also, the colossal bronze statue of Athena Promachos on the Acropolis in Athens, which could be seen from afar by mariners at sea, was his work. We can form only an imperfect idea of Phidias's gigantic statue of the Athena of the Parthenon, for, like so many others of that period, it has completely disappeared. Later, there developed the new Attic school, which attained the height of its power in the works of Scopas of Paros, and above all, of Praxiteles of Athens. The rediscovered statue of Hermes to the north of the Olympian temple gives us an idea of the perfected art of Praxiteles. And the great sculptors, Euphranor of Corinth and Lysippos of Sicyon, must not be left unmentioned. Of the hundreds on hundreds of less well-known masters we know usually not even the names. Of course, fewer by far of the works of Greek painters have been preserved. From the accounts of the ancients, we gather that a great number of famous schools existed in every part of the country, like the Ionic school of painters in Asia Minor, especially in Ephesus, where Zeuxis and Parrhasius worked, the schools of Sicyon, Paestum, and so on. Polygnotus from the island of Thasos is usually spoken of as the first painter of outstanding importance. But Apelles seems to have produced the greatest works in the field of painting. The ancients are filled with his praise. The art of the Greeks found expression in every object of daily use. It swept, like a transfiguring inspiration, over every phenomenon of public and private life, as we can see from the numberless vases with their charming paintings, and from the unearthed gems, cameos, and engraved precious stones of the most varied kinds that so arouse our admiration. One can hardly overestimate the outstanding greatness and the infinite many-sidedness of this people, even though one does not lose sight of their darker side and counts it in for its full worth. No other people in ancient history has been able to exert such power of attraction on the greatest minds of all later times. Countless books have been written in every language about every branch of their rich creative activity, and even now, hardly a year passes which does not bring to light new and important material concerning the culture of ancient Hellas. If one turns to observe what was the status among the Greeks of that national and political unity which is asserted to be the indispensable preliminary to the development of any kind of culture among a people, one comes to conclusions that are utterly destructive of this view. Ancient Hellas never knew what national unity meant, and when towards the end of its history national political unity was forcibly imposed on it from without, it was the end of Grecian culture, which then had to find another home for its creative activities. The Greek spirit simply could not endure the national political experiment, and was gradually extinguished in the countries in which its force had poured forth most strongly for centuries. What united the Grecian tribes and peoples was their common culture, which revealed itself everywhere in thousands upon thousands of different forms, not the artificially woven bond of national political community, in which no one in Greece felt any interest and the essence of which was always alien to the Hellenes. Greece was politically the most dismembered country on earth. Every city took zealous care lest its political independence be assailed. For this, the inhabitants of even the smallest of them were in no mind to surrender. Each of these little city republics had its own constitution, its own social life with its own cultural peculiarities, and this it was that gave to Hellenic life as a whole its variegated wealth of genuine cultural values. Albrecht Wirth has rightly said, "The achievements of the Greeks were the more astounding the more they were, as a people, torn and divided. No one ever succeeded in uniting their infinity of different tribes for any collective deed in any single opinion. They all always valued highly their membership in their own folk group, but they did not possess enough power of sacrifice, enough political feeling to weld them into one great whole, to subordinate it to their separate ambitions. But it was just this lack of political feeling which quickened the cultural activity of the Greeks, yes, which first made them spiritually susceptible to it. When Aristotle was collecting the material for his work on the constitutions of the Hellenes, he found himself under the necessity of extending his undertaking over 158 municipalities, each of which presented a political entity in itself, and because of its autonomy, had its own peculiar social characteristics. Even the topography of the whole peninsula was highly favorable to such a development of social life. The land is mountainous in parts, and enjoys a mild and delightful climate, which without doubt exerted a strong influence on the minds and souls of the inhabitants. Lovely and fruitful valleys cut across the landscape in every direction. The sea penetrates deep into the land in countless bays, and provides on three sides the most wonderful coastline one could conceive of. Added to this, a multitude of larger and smaller islands connect to the peninsula with Asia Minor, almost like a bridge. This entire rich natural setting was unusually variable, and could but inspire in men reflections that would have been denied them anywhere else. Every part of the country had its peculiar character, which helped to give a definite stamp to the activities of the inhabitants. Thus was awakened and furthered that rich diversity of intellectual and social life which is so characteristic of ancient Hellas. As to the Greeks themselves, It is today becoming constantly clearer to us that they were neither a homogeneous people nor a pure race. Everything indicates rather that we have to do here with an exceptionally happy intermixture of different folk and race elements fused into spiritual unity by a common culture. The assertion that the Hellenes were a people of the Germanic race, which invaded the peninsula and gradually subdued the resident population, is, in that sweeping form, confirmed by no intelligible proof. The harder scientific research tries to penetrate the veil that still covers the primitive history of Greece, the more does it bring to light facts which indicate exactly the opposite. That the peninsula suffered from frequent invasions of foreign tribes that pressed in from the north is unquestioned, but we are still far from a clear understanding of the racial affiliation of those tribes, whose origin is completely lost in the mists of unrecorded time. Most of these invasions occurred in a prehistoric epoch and kept large sections of the country in constant ferment, as we learn from the traditions of the Greeks themselves. By these migrations and continual conflicts, whole populations were driven out of their homeland and fled to the islands in the Aegean or to the coast of Asia Minor. The greatest of these migrations was that of the Dorians, which is believed to have occurred about 1100 years before our era, and which gave rise to great changes in the social life of the country. But these migrations from the north were certainly not the only ones, and there is much ground for believing that long before these invasions, Asiatic tribes had already forced their way into the future home of the Hellenes. Numerous traces of Asiatic influence in the mythology of the Greeks, and very emphatically, the names of many cities and localities bear witness to this. How far the influence of the Semitic Phoenicians extended on the Grecian mainland has not yet been incontestably established. That this influence could have been no small one is shown by the fact that a great number of the islands that were later Grecian, such as the Cyclades, the Sporades, Rhodes, Cyprus, and Crete, were colonized by the Phoenicians long before the existence of Greek society. The Carian people of Asia Minor also left distinct traces in Greece. Only from them can we derive the names of the citadel of Caria in Megara and of the legendary King Car. Of the Dorians, Aeolians, and Ionians, which are usually regarded as the three principal lines of the Greeks, the Ionians, the most highly endowed and culturally most advanced of them all, seem to have the smallest infusion of Hellenic blood. A large number of famous historians have made mention of the extensive intermixture of the Ionians with Semitic and other Oriental peoples. Ernst Curtius, and others with him, have even placed the original home of the Ionians in Asia Minor. In support of this view, Curtius urges, chiefly, that only in Asia Minor can the existence of an Ionian country be historically established. Of course, this does not prove that the Ionians really stem from there. They might merely have migrated into Asia Minor and established a settlement there. Herodotus, too, referred in different places to the non-Hellenic origin of the Ionians, especially of the Athenians, and designated them as descendants of the Pelasgians, who only later adopted the Greek language. From all this, one fact emerges clearly, that the Greeks present no particular national political unity, nor one of race and descent, and that all assertions to the contrary rest merely on vague surmises and indefinite wish concepts. Quite in accord with our earlier conclusions, unity was found only in the Greek culture, which spread from the west coast of Asia Minor and the islands of the Aegean to Sicily and southern Italy. To this must be added separate settlements in the Crimea, on the eastern shores of the Black Sea, and at the mouth of the Rhone. It must therefore have been other causes which furthered the growth of such an outstandingly rich and splendid culture as the Hellenic, and we do not feel that we go astray when we see by far the most important and decisive of these causes in the political separateness and national diversity of the country. It was this healthy decentralization, this internal separation of Greece into hundreds of little communities, tolerating no uniformity, which constantly roused the mind to the consideration of new matters. Every larger political structure leads inevitably to a certain rigidity of the cultural life and destroys that fruitful rivalry between separate communities which is so characteristic of the whole life of the Grecian cities. Taine depicts very clearly this political status in ancient Hellas. To modern eyes, the Greek state seems like a miniature painting. Argolis had a length of 40 to 50 and a breadth of 20 to 25 miles. Laconia was of about the same size. Achaia is a narrow strip of land on the flank of a mountain range that slopes down to the sea. All Attica does not equal half of one of our smallest French departments. The territory of Corinth, Sicyon, and Megara extends for only an hour's journey. In general, and above all in the islands and the settlements, a state was merely a city on the coast with a circle of farms about it. From one acropolis, one looked across to the acropolis or the mountains of a neighbor city. In such a narrow enclosure, everything is clear and easily understood. The intellectual fatherland has about it nothing of the gigantic, the abstract, and the indefinite, as with us. The mind can embrace it. It is identified with the physical fatherland. Both are outlined in the mind of the citizen by distinct boundaries. To conceive of Athens, Corinth, Argos, or Sparta, he thinks of the recesses of its valley, or of the outline of its city. He is acquainted with all of its citizens, just as he can picture all its boundaries, and the narrowness of his political enclosure, like the form of his corporeal enclosure, supplies him in advance with that middling, limited type in which all his intellectual conceptions will be shaped. These words reveal to us the whole nature of the Grecian city. In such a miniature state, man's love of the homeland identifies itself completely with his love of the community. Homeland and fatherland are still one and the same, and have nothing in common with the abstract modern idea of the fatherland. Therefore, the so-called national idea was always entirely alien to the Greeks, and even in times of the most pressing danger could not strike root among them. In Homer, one finds not the slightest trace of national fellowship, and there is nothing to show that the national idea was any more appealing to the Greeks in the bloom of their culture. It was merely the consciousness of belonging to a common culture that held the Greek cities together. That is the reason why the colonizings of the Greeks had quite another character than those of all the other peoples of antiquity. The Phoenicians thought of their colonies primarily as associates in trade. For the Romans, they played the part of subject territories which were economically drained by the mother country and were entirely dependent on the Roman state. Not so with the Greeks. They founded their colonies on the same notion as their cities in the closer homeland, as independent organizations which were, indeed, linked to the mother country by the same culture, but which otherwise felt in themselves the pulse beat of their own separate lives. A colony had, moreover, its own constitution, was a polis in itself, and competed with the cities of the homeland in the independent development of its own cultural life. Since the area of the Greek municipality extended to only a few square miles, every citizen was easily able to keep track of the entire public life, and to form his own judgment about everything, a circumstance of great importance, which is utterly inconceivable in our modern state organization with the wide ramifications of its governmental machinery and the complicated gearing of its bureaucratic institutions. Hence, the perplexed helplessness of the citizen of the modern state, his exaggerated overvaluation of governmental proclamations and of political leadership, which deprive him of all personal initiative. Since he is, of course, not in a position to keep track of all the fields of activity of the modern state and its internal and external policy, and is, on the other hand, so firmly convinced of the unalterable fixedness of all these functions that he believes he would sink into a bottomless quicksand if the political equilibrium were at all disturbed, his feeling of his own personal unimportance and dependence upon the state becomes strengthened, and his belief in the absolute necessity of political authority, which today is deeper seated in man than his belief in the authority of God, becomes deeper still. So, at best, he dreams only of a change of the persons at the head of the state, and does not comprehend that all the inadequacies and evils of the political machine which constantly oppress him depend on the very existence of the state itself, and hence always recur in any of the various forms it may assume. Not so with the Greek. Since he could more easily get a view of the inner workings of the polis, he was in a better position to pass judgment on the conduct of his leading men. He had their earthbound humanity always before his eyes, and was the more interested in his own affairs because his intellectual agility was not crippled by blind faith in authority. In no country were the great men so exposed to the judgment of public opinion as in Greece at the time of its highest cultural development. Even the greatest and most undeniable merit afforded no protection in this regard. Men of the stature of a Miltiades, a Themistocles, had to experience this in their own persons. In this way, public life in Greece was kept always in flux, and no one fixed ordering of affairs could persist for long. Thus were the personal freedom and possibilities of development of the individual best safeguarded. His initiative did not exhaust itself on the dead forms of a central state authority. In this condition of intellectual freedom lay the sources of that magnificent culture, the powerful development of which cannot otherwise be explained. Sir Francis Galton mentions correctly that Athens alone, most important of the Greek city republics, and the one where spiritual freedom was most at home in the course of a single century from 530 to 430 BC, produced not fewer than 10 of the most outstanding men of Grecian history, namely Miltiades, Themistocles, Aristides, Cimon, Pericles, Thucydides, Socrates, Xenophon, Plato, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Phidias. The English scholar adds that only Florence, where under similar conditions a culture as rich, even if of altogether different type, developed, can be compared with Athens in this respect. This spirit of creative activity reached its high state of perfection in every city of Greece, with the exception of Sparta, which never freed itself from the domination of the aristocracy, while all the other cities were finding the way to democracy. In Sparta, therefore, the idea of political sovereignty played the decisive role, to which everything else was subordinate. True, it is undeniable that in Athens, Thebes, and Corinth, forces were always present that worked for a political sovereignty in the country. But that merely proves that every form of the state stands as a hindrance in the way of culture, even when its power is ever so limited. But the complete political and national separateness of Greece took the strength out of these efforts toward an extension of power. Even where they had a passing success, it was only momentary, and never attained the status of an established political order, such as is proper to all great states. Nietzsche, years ago, recognized the internal opposition between polis and culture, and characterized the allegedly necessary connection between them as a delusion. Not only did Greece know no unified national state, it had never learned to recognize a priestly hierarchy like that of the Babylonians, the Egyptians, or the Persians, after which, as prototype, the papacy was later formed. And since there was no church, there was also no theology and no catechism. The religion of the Hellenes was an airy structure, in the development of which the poets had a much greater share than the priests. The religious concepts did not support the dogmatism of a theological caste, and were scarcely any hindrance to freedom of thought. The Greek thought of his gods differently than most other Oriental peoples. He clothed them all with the qualities of human greatness and human weakness, and faced them therefore with that rare simplicity which gives to his religious concepts a peculiar tone to be found among no other people of antiquity. This is also the reason why the idea of hereditary sin remained always alien to the Hellenes. Schiller was quite right when he said that while in Greece the gods were regarded as human, man had to feel himself divine. All Olympus was, so to speak, a faithful copy of the rich Hellenic cultural life, with its internal political separateness, its colorful manifoldness and constructive power, its constant rivalry, and its utter humanness, and all too humanness. In Hellas, too, man mirrored himself in his gods. Only when one sees clearly what a crippling influence the Christian Church exerted for centuries on the intellectual life of Europe, how it has supported every despotism and remains today the unconquered stronghold of every intellectual and social reaction, does one comprehend what a chasm yawns between the religious experiences of the Greek and the dead, soul-shackling dogmas of the Christian Church. There are few periods in history when the necessary conditions for the unfolding of a great culture were so prodigally provided as in ancient Hellas. What might seem to the modern statesman the great defect in the Hellenic world, the extreme political dividedness of the country, was the greatest blessing for the rich and unrestricted development of its cultural strength. How little of the feeling for national unity there was among the Greeks was shown most conspicuously at the time of the Persian Wars. If there ever was a time calculated to awaken a national consciousness among the Greek tribes, this was the time when Persian despotism had set itself to put an end to the freedom and independence of the Greek cities. The danger which threatened the Hellenes, then, was equally great for all. No one could have had the faintest illusion about this. Everyone knew what a Persian victory meant for the Greek community. But it was just at that time of greatest danger that the political disunion of the Hellenes became most noticeable. Already at the time of the victorious expedition of Harpagon, who, under orders from the Persian king Cyrus, brought most of the Greek cities in Asia Minor under Persian domination, and later, at the time of the Ionic Revolt, there were two occurrences of far-reaching importance, which might be regarded as a foretaste of the late Persian Wars, and which showed, so unmistakably, the complete lack of any unified national effort among the Greeks, that a unified resistance against the Persians never came to pass.
Miletus, which was so cruelly punished at the suppression of the Ionic Revolt, on the occasion of the military expedition of Harpagon, left the other cities altogether in the lurch, in order to negotiate a favorable peace with the Persians. Only a few cities carried on the war to the bitter end. Most of them, when they saw that any resistance to the Persians was vain, preferred to abandon the old soil and to found for themselves a new home at a distance. The Spartans refused any help whatever to the revolting Greek cities in Asia Minor, which simply cannot be reconciled with a strongly developed national feeling. The Athenians supported the Ionic Revolt, chiefly because the tyrant Hippias, whom they had exiled, had found asylum at the Persian court, and from there had instigated continuous cabals against his native city. These petty potentates, who, before the introduction of the republican form of the state, had established themselves in almost every Grecian city, allowed themselves to be controlled by no national considerations, and were always ready to perform the most menial services for the Persian despots in exchange for assistance in suppressing the struggles for freedom put up by their own people. The machinations of men like Pisistratus in Athens, Aloytos in Thessaly, and the Spartan king Demaratus proved this. When at last the Persian king Darius got his hands free, he sent a great army against Eretria and Athens, which cities he especially hated because of their great support of the Ionic revolt. Still, it was clear that his attack was directed at all Greece, for Persian power was not safe in Asia Minor until the Hellenes there were deprived of the possibility of receiving aid from the cities of the mother country. The danger was great, the more so because the tyrant Hippias was with the Persian army and, as a Greek, could render them many a useful service. Despite this, there was no trace of a kindling of national consciousness among the Hellenes. Sparta's attitude was ambiguous, as always, this despite the fact that the Persian emissaries who were sent to demand earth and water as tokens of submission were thrown into a well, with the suggestion that they would there be able to collect for themselves what they wanted. Many cities on the islands, and also on the mainland, had submitted almost without resistance, among them the greater part of the Boeotians. Even the closest neighbors of the Athenians, the inhabitants of the island of Aegina, would risk no resistance to the Persian army and preferred surrender to probable capture. When at last at Marathon it came to a decisive combat between the land forces of the Persians and the Greeks, in which the latter faced an overwhelmingly superior force, the Athenians took the field almost alone, for, except for 1,000 hoplites whom the Plataeans had sent, no other aid was at hand. Even the Spartans, who had entered the war against the Persians, appeared on the field only after the battle, and contributed nothing to the tremendous victory of Miltiades and his troops. By the victory at Marathon, the danger which had threatened Hellas was for the time being averted, and the Persian generals were compelled to lead their troops back to Asia. Nevertheless, it must certainly have been clear to everyone that, though the danger was certainly postponed for a while, it was by no means ended. There was no vestige of a doubt that the Persian despotism would set all its forces at work to get even for the defeat it had suffered. The whole situation was so unequivocal that no one in Hellas could have misunderstood it. One might therefore have expected that the Greeks would have availed themselves of the short breathing spell to prepare better to face the approaching danger. If there had existed in Greece the slightest trace of that national spirit of which uncritical historians have so much to say, it would by all means surely have revealed itself in such a perilous situation. But there occurred nothing which one could point to as revealing a strengthening of the national consciousness. Internal conditions in Greece remained the same. Sparta, whose military and political prestige had been greatly impaired by the Athenian victory at Marathon, from then on directed its whole political activity to obstructing in every way the rapid development of Athens. This presented to the Persian aristocracy a much more important problem than the Persian danger. When, then, in 480 BC, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, the Persian king Xerxes threatened Greece with an enormous army on land and a mighty fleet along its coast, the general situation of the Greeks was not better by a single hair than on the occasion of the first Persian attack. Even then there appeared no trace of national unanimity in the face of the frightful danger which threatened all alike. At first there was universal panic. Still no one thought of a common defense of national interests. Thebes, within whose walls the so-called Median party had achieved a strong influence, fostered beyond a doubt by the Persian despot, submitted to the enemy without resistance. Several tribes in the more central parts of the country followed suit. Boeotians, Thessalians, and Achaeans tried by submission to escape the danger which threatened them. But even the famous assembly on the Isthmus, to which the few cities that had resolved on resistance sent representatives, presented anything but a picture of national resolution. First of all, the Spartans could not be induced to throw their entire military power into the northern part of the country to confront the advancing hostile army. They were clearly quite willing to allow central Greece to be laid waste, and there was hardly a doubt that the ruling caste in Sparta would gladly have seen Athens destroyed by the Persians and themselves thus freed from an embarrassing rival. The whole role of the Spartans at this time was just as ambiguous as it had been 10 years before in the war against Darius. When, at last, in order to avoid making their secret purposes all too manifest, they were compelled to consent to putting up a resistance to the Persians at Thermopylae, they sent Leonidas with only 300 Spartan citizens and about 1,000 Perioeci, with whom a few other tribes joined. Altogether, the number of heavy-armed soldiers was less than 4,000, a ridiculously small number compared to the gigantic horde of the Persians. When Grote and other celebrated narrators of Grecian history express doubts of the sincerity of the Spartans, their reason is only too evident in the light of the historical facts. Even later when, after the disastrous defeat of his fleet at Salamis, Xerxes was compelled to retreat across the Hellespont with the greater part of his army, Sparta continued to pursue the same equivocal tactics. Xerxes, it was true, had withdrawn into Asia, but he had left behind in Thessaly a strong army under his general Mardonius, who was to winter there in order to renew the war in the spring. But just at this final decisive battle, the Spartan king Pausanias, who had the supreme command of the fighting forces of the Hellenes, displayed such an appalling lack of decision that it seemed to hint at treachery. The end of Pausanias, who on a later occasion was led into open betrayal of the interests of the Greeks, justifies the suspicion that even at the time he had struck a secret bargain with Mardonius. This supposition gains probability if we take into consideration that before the opening of hostilities, Mardonius had made a secret proposal to the Athenians that they should enter into an alliance with him, promising that their independence should be in no way impaired. The Athenians proudly rejected the proposal, and it is easy to conjecture that Mardonius at once tried it on Pausanias, and from him met with a better response. At any rate, the whole behavior of Pausanias before the Battle of Plataea lends itself to such an interpretation. If, in spite of their superiority, and in spite of their secret machinations, the Persians were still decisively defeated, it was because the troops of the Hellenes, who fought for their independence and their freedom, and who had to lose nothing less than their all, were animated by a very different spirit than the gigantic army of the Persians, welded together by the will of a despot, and in large part merely impressed for the war from foreign populations. For this reason, the Greeks won despite their national divisions and their political disunion, without their having been aware of these as weaknesses. The attempt of many historians to interpret the later Peloponnesian War as a struggle over the national unity of Greece is without any secure foundation. Mautner has strikingly commented on the unreasonableness of this assertion. Let one only think, for example, that during the nearly 30 years long Peloponnesian War, the idea of a Hellenic nationality practically did not make its appearance. Of course, a man like Alcibiades, who under the stress of wrath and need put his inventive talent at the disposal, now of his fellow Athenians, now of the hostile Spartans, now of the hereditary enemy in Persia, was even at that time an exception. But even among the simple Greeks, those were rare who had formed any conception of their nationality, who as conscious Pan-Hellenes or all Grecians desired the end of the war. The idea of nationality was not yet effective, despite their love for their homeland, for their city. In that long and bloody conflict in which Greece slashed at its own flesh and gnawed at its own vitals, the struggle was not over the national political unity of the Grecian tribes, but over the question, autonomy or hegemony. What was to be decided was which of the larger cities should hold the leadership, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, or Corinth. After the Persian Wars, culture, especially in Athens, had expanded into fullest bloom. But the victory over the Persians had contributed strongly to the extension of the consciousness of political power. The Athenians, who, with their allies, continued the war against the Persians and wished to secure for the Grecian cities in Asia Minor liberation from the Persian yoke, was not actuated by purely economic motives. The principal ground of their behavior was undoubtedly the conviction that an alliance of free cities in Asia Minor would constitute a strong bulwark against further attacks by the Persian despotism. While the Spartans and the other Peloponnesian cities had withdrawn from the war, Athens and the cities which had identified themselves with her undertakings founded the Delian Attic League, which was at first a free federation of independent communities. Within its framework, every city enjoyed the same rights. But this was ended with the development of the hegemony, which gradually conceded to Athens greater and greater privileges, which she could hold only at the expense of her allies. This brought the political motive ever more sharply into the foreground of social life. This is precisely the curse of every power of whatever sort, that its holders misuse it. Against this manifestation no reform helps, no safety valve in the Constitution, however far-sightedly devised, for it springs from the innermost nature of power itself and is therefore inevitable. It is not the external form, but power as such that leads to misuse. The striving after power opens gate and door to all the foul and fateful passions of man. When Goethe once spoke of the ruin that politics works on character, he may well have been thinking of that obsession with power which lies at the foundation of all politics. Everything which seems to us base and contemptible in private life becomes, when statesmen use it, patriotic virtue, provided that success trades on its heels. And since, with the extension of power, more and more economic wealth falls into the laps of its possessors, there develops a system of venality and corruption that gradually undermines all social morale, without which no community can long endure. So power becomes a terrible scourge to social life and its creative cultural forces. Even the Grecian polis proved no exception to this rule, and fell into inner dissolution just in the proportion that political ambition got the upper hand in it. Moreover, it was shown then, and has ever since been constantly confirmed, that war, which hopeless fools celebrate as the rejuvenation of social life, usually affects the victor more injuriously than the vanquished. Because, as one of its consequences, it enriches immoderately certain sections in the community, displaces the earlier limits of well-being, and thus disturbs the social equilibrium to such a degree that it becomes constantly more difficult to speak of a community of social interests, and the class contrasts in society manifest themselves more strongly and more undisguisedly. It happened thus in Athens also. Hand in hand with the luxuriant growth of a money oligarchy went the impoverishment of the lower sections of the people, the destruction of the ancient foundations of their society. On this and on her slave economy, Greece was at last to wreck herself. The struggle for the hegemony, which found such overpowering expression in the Peloponnesian War, at the same time initiated the decline of Greek culture and prepared the way for the subjugation of Greece by the Macedonian monarchy, for it led everywhere, in Athens, in Sparta, in Thebes, to the same inevitable results. The one pleasing phenomenon in the struggle for leadership is the fact that none of the larger cities was able to maintain its predominance for any length of time, because the sense of freedom of the Hellenes always impelled the individual cities to revolt and to shake off the yoke that had been imposed on them. But the war lasted too long and undermined completely the foundations of social life. After the termination of hostilities, all the cities were so exhausted that they were no match for the approaching Macedonian peril. The less so because, owing to the upsetting of customs and the decay of all moral principles which resulted from the war and the struggle for power, the Macedonian king was able to keep agents in almost every city who worked actively in the furtherance of his plans. In fact, the moral depravity was most complete exactly at the time when Demosthenes was vainly striving to arouse Hellas to a united defense against the Macedonian peril. Alexander of Macedon at last established the national political unity of Greece with the sword by bringing the whole country under his own overlordship. He was the real founder of that so-called Hellenism, which servile historians have acclaimed as the zenith of Greek culture. In reality, it was an intellectual decline, incapable of any renewal of its life. Alexander laid the foundation for a unified Grecian kingdom, and in doing this, he destroyed the inexhaustible diversity of that rich cultural life which was so characteristic of the Greek communities at the time of their bloom. The former citizens of free cities became subjects of the unified national state, which directed all its forces to reducing every manifestation of social life to the dead level of its political purposes. Hellenism was merely a substitute for a culture which could flourish only in freedom. It was the triumph of the uncreative exploiter over the creative spirit of the Greek city. Most historiographers honor Alexander as the great disseminator of Hellenic culture over the enormous territories of his kingdom, but they overlook the fact that he, unmindful of his own victory over the Persian military power, fell, in thought and action, ever more under the spell of Persian notions of domination, and set himself to the task of transplanting these to Europe. Grote is entirely right when, in his History of Greece, he maintains that Alexander did not make Persia Grecian, but Greece Persian, thus strangling forever the further development of its culture. Yes, that his actual purpose was to convert Hellas into a satrapy, as the Romans later made it into a province of their world realm. Under his rule, and that of his successors, the springs of the ancient Grecian culture dried up. For a long time men fed on its abundance, but it developed no new products. National political unity sounded the death knell of Hellenic culture.
This has been a production of Audible Anarchist. You can find more Audible Anarchist on YouTube.